appealing to him to do the right thing, sign this bill, let us finally build this pipeline, let us get our people working.
That's Oklahoma's Governor Mary Fallin. In this week's GOP address, Fallin saying what the pipeline is really about is jobs and hope for the future.
Not politics, not Republicans and Democrats. It's about jobs. It's about energy. It's about infrastructure.
The pipeline would support more than 40,000 jobs. Fallon saying the Keystone Project would be a safe, cost-effective way to transport oil and help secure our country's energy independence.
A female terrorist suspect tracked through social media. The Blaze Radio's Chris Vermillion.
She's a Toronto resident, and her profile picture on Twitter is of an ISIS beheading. And now Canadian counter-terror agencies are calling her Toronto Jane as they track her movements across northern Africa.
Why is a female there? And the only thing that we can come up with in terms of an explanation is she's doing spying activities for ISIS.
Jeff Wires, a researcher with iBravo, a counter-terror agency in Canada, speaking with CNN and saying there are other questions that need to be answered about the female operative.
On a mission given to me by Woody Shaw, Sunship, Dizzy, and John Kahn, dedicated to pursuing a piece of our cultural heritage through interviews with my music heroes, this is The Jake Feinberg Show.
Sometimes at night I dream, still that hairy man, shadow box in the apocalypse, wandering the land. Shadow box in the apocalypse, wandering the land. Thank you so much for making us part of your day today. My show revolves around the 4 L's: leadership, love, life, and lineage, and the ongoing story of real music made by real people. It's still the 50s versus the 60s today in America. Those who are seekers versus those who play by some imaginary set of rules, conjured up by man's view of God and his beliefs about mysticism and magic. It's that thin layer just above consciousness when you leave the physical world and the perceptions and the worry and the profits on the burning shore. What's funny now is that those who pushed back in the 60s now seem more like their opponents in the 50s as they refuse to hand the baton off to younger street cats making love in a more interconnected, more image-enhanced, more digitized society. I want to live in America. I do. And my show exists because of nonconformists like my guest, who preferred to surround himself with a heterogeneous mix of people you might find in a hotel on Mars, while the doors of perception churn with tons of steel known as the Keystone Pipeline, which will be buried underneath the wolves by the silver stream in the hallowed land that my guest pioneered hundreds, if not thousands of times. My guest grew up in Wyoming and was inculcated with how it was, is, and will be. The game was over, the fix was in, until my guest went off to Wesleyan, where he sought his own newfound truths about existentialism and the multidimensional self. He tripped out with Timothy Leary and was back at the ranch drinking champagne from his cowboy boot when boarding school yahoo Bob Weir re-entered my guest's life. It was at that point my guest turned his years of experiential learning into legacy. While Bobby worked on the melody, my guest wrote poetry that wove its way inside and out of the fabric of our culture. Gone astray, you say, every day by the bay, because voices tell me so. My guest has always been on the edge of impulse, creating terminology that encapsulates the insatiable web world, a world that his daughters are fully a part of with new media and social media and communist media and the Electronic Frontier Foundation. His experience in the world of the dead kept him in the moment of now because there is a fear down here we can't forget. It's got different names like perception and rumination and orthodoxy and ego, all the things that my guest left in the treetops to go looking for his kite. He is cagey, hard to corral, irascible, and somewhat of a street scholar, preferring experience over information. In 1999, he was ranked one of the top 25 most influential people in business, even though he's not in financial services. In Jehovah's Favorite Choir, he worked closely with a real choir boy named Brent Midland, helping him get stuff out of his system, because maybe you know how it feels, but maybe you don't. Maybe to you it don't seem so real. My guest has spent much of this century traveling to the origins of man in Africa, Mother Africa, where he can bring his bright blue ball to elucidate and inspire legions of young people who may not have every gadget or material good, but they desire to seek, to evolve, to grow, see completion, and change their world by being themselves. The stratosphere is his church, in conjunction with the soul, which is what my show is about, and is something my guest did not believe in until he tragically lost his soulmate, Elizabeth Horner. Not a domestic partner, or someone who would make a good wife or husband, but a soulmate. He docks emotionally and immediately. Either you're in or you're out, and I'm all in. That wasn't always the case, but all that lightning will be my lightning too. John Perry Barlow, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Goodness gracious, what an introduction.
How are you, brother? Yeah, I'll tell you, and
I'm all right.
That just flowed out of me in about 10 minutes on Monday, and so thank you so much for being. I mean, it really is. I told my engineer, I said, I can't think of any other cat that is more inspiring to talk to. I talked to you 15 years ago, but have the chance again to do it, man, it's just an honor. So I hope you enjoyed it, and let's get cracking, huh?
All righty.
Question.
Well, it sounds like you come up with plenty of things you could talk about.
Oh, we're gonna roll, man. I was doing some research last night, and you said something really fascinating. This is going back to around the Arab Spring and also the WikiLeaks, and you said something to the effect of what I guess my question is, what is the right model of monetizing free speech? Because you talked about it in a capitalist form of it's not about.
Well,
Go ahead.
I think it's paradoxical to think that you can own free speech. I mean, as soon as you've contained it by ownership, and I have a difficult time thinking you can own any kind of speech. I don't think that's the right way to monetize it, but certainly if it's expression, which is the fundamental purpose of which is to set people free or to maintain liberty. The last thing on earth you want to do is turn into some kind of commercial commodity and thereby limit its capacity to spread because you want that word in every heart. So it's ridiculous to try to wrap some kind of phony container around expression and then having done so, call it content. Mm-hmm. And talk about how people or consumers, I guess we call themselves now, consume it. And I, frankly, haven't the slightest idea what becomes of my song after it's been consumed. But I'll tell you, it's different than what becomes of a McDonald's burger.
Can you? I mean, for the audience and for myself. I mean, you mentioned a cable carrier in this TED Talk speech that I was watching, but can you talk about a couple of other companies, industries that are threatening free speech?
Oh, I should say that the entire industrial period and most of its institutional artifacts are threatening free speech. There's the way in which power has been mediated over the last 2,500 years has been less by use of the sword and the gun than it has been by the word. And you have dominant over much of the planet, so you have three main monotheistic religions that derive all of their authority from the word, that being some set of words that their preferred hotline to God has laid down.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that you can constrain people's thinking a lot with a narrowly defined set of words. I mean, if all you can know about the world, all you can know with any authority is what God has supposedly laid out on the subject, then that puts you in a position of utter powerlessness to act with understanding that is more comprehensive. So I wrote back in about 1989 that I felt like the internet, with its capacity to leak truth into practically any container, would have a profoundly deleterious effect on monotheism. And I would say that the way in which the three great monotheistic religions are behaving, primarily with each other at the present time, is very strong evidence that I was right about that.
Mm-hmm.
These fanatical exercises remind me of Nietzsche's definition of fanatic, which was that a fanatic was somebody who'd half lost sight of his original convictions. And you would expect, as doubts arose, that you would see increasing numbers of true believers whose true beliefs had become capitalized, italicized, and made out of titanium. There's almost no flexibility now in their willingness to believe that there's more to what goes on in the world than can be contained within those books.
John, I wanted to just interject. You know, why do you think that there is this fanaticism or rigidity as it relates to their view of their religion? Is it because they feel like whatever tenets or traditions they're holding on to, they're losing, so they're becoming desperate? I guess what I'm trying to say is, I listen vociferously, if that's the right word. We opened up with Brother Esau. It could be a bunch of things, but your writing, Michael Omardian or Stormy Omardian's writing of Christian rock in the 70s, a lot more mysticism, a lot more magic, a lot less about what man thinks is God. And today I hear a lot of literal interpretation. Why do you think that people are in these religions are becoming more desperate?
Well, because they're going down. They're becoming desperate because they can see the handwriting on the wall
Mm-hmm.
of the Bible. The future of anybody's ability, any institution's ability to define consciousness by defining what can be read or believed in is increasingly limited when you've got a world where anybody, anywhere can know anything that they want to know more about.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Limits of their curiosity, and of course the current limits of human knowledge on that subject. But if I want to become an expert on something, I've got all the material, and that is profoundly threatening to a religion that is based on a fairly high degree of willful ignorance.
You know, talking to John Perry Barlow here on Power Talk 1210. You know, I talked to John McLaughlin, guys like Felix Cavallari, who were, you know, playing. Cavallari was in the Rascals around the time that you were at Wesleyan, but I would love you to talk to the audience about a couple of gurus that you had in your pursuits when you went to Wesleyan. You studied comparative religion, but I have to believe that Barlow went out and you found some cats. I mean, Cavallari had a guru, McLaughlin had Sri Chimnoy, and I'm just trying to figure out, did you seek and did you make up your own educational system at Wesleyan?
Well, you know, I was very lucky to just happen upon Wesleyan at the time. Wesleyan had owned my weekly reader, which you would not think of being a gigantic moneymaker, but it certainly was. And they sold my weekly reader to Xerox for stock in 1962. So by the time I matriculated in 1965, they had more money per student than any other academic institution in the universe. And they were somewhat, as the suddenly wealthy generally are, they were somewhat unprepared for it. But one of the things they did, thank God, was to bring a lot of marvelous luminaries onto the campus as part of something called the Center for Advanced Studies. And most of these fellows or women were considered by the undergrads to be unapproachable because they were so dominant in their field. But I had a lot of gall, and every time I walked by their office doors, they were open, and the person would be in there looking a little bit bored, so I just started coming in.
Right. And this is what I want to hear. Yep.
Yeah, you know, so, and I was very fortunate to get to know reasonably well Buckminster Fuller and John Cage and Hannah Arendt and Paul Horgan and Jerzy Kaczynski and Richard Wilbur, who was my poetry teacher and was at that time the poet laureate of the United States. And it's a long and illustrious list of people that taken together had an enormous effect on my thinking. One person who I achieved contact with on a more extracurricular basis was Joseph Campbell, and I had kind of a thing for Jewish girls. So I spent a lot of time at Sarah Lawrence anyway, and he had a Monday morning class down there. So I would generally go down to prey on the girls of Sarah Lawrence and redeem myself on Monday morning by auditing Joe Campbell's class. And then he later became a good friend of the Grateful Dead. Mostly through Mickey, but through me as well.
Joseph Campbell said the insecure way is the secure way. I guess I just was hoping you could talk about maybe one.
Well, sure. Yeah. I'm sorry to blunderbuss, but I mean, the reality is that with me or anybody else, I think it's an extremely rare human being without imposing some kind of ex post facto construct on his life. Say that, well, yes, it was all about this person. I mean, if there is one person that I would say caused the greatest pivot in my life, it would be Gilberto Gil, who I didn't encounter until much later on. I tend to look at my life as being that part of it was spent before I knew Gil, and that part of it was spent after.
Can you please tell me the first time that you met Timothy Leary?
The first time I met Timothy Leary, I was in a Vassar mixer. And he wasn't there, but there was a very evocative kind of Indian-looking fella. For good reason, he was from India.
Right.
And he was kind of observing with mild amusement from the corners of the room. And I finally decided that he seemed like the most interesting character in the room, despite his, inadequacies of equipment. And I started talking to him, and he was very interesting. He told me that he was living in an estate out in Millbrook that had been converted into a research facility. We're doing research on ways to extend the mind. And since I'd always been passionately interested in that very topic, I asked him if he wanted to ride out to where he was staying after the mixer, and yes, he did. It was god-awful rainy night. I don't know how he thought he was going to get back up to Billy Hitchcock's place, but I guess like most asses, as he assumed that the good Lord would provide.
Right.
Anyway, we went out there, and it was fairly late at night, but Tim was still up, and I knew who he was. I was really excited to find the rabbit hole that I'd fallen down, because I'd heard about this stuff, and I'd been very interested in it, largely because I had been a very devout Mormon when I was a kid, and it had been fundamental in giving me the right set of substrate material and surrounding berms of containment for me to pass through what was a fairly tumultuous early adolescence, late childhood, early adolescence. And then, when I was about 14, I'd been head of a, very solid Mormon Boy Scout troop in Pinedale, Wyoming, and I went out and got one of these little cheap motorcycles that Mr. Honda had started sending over from Japan. It's called the Honda 305B, and it basically looked like it would fit in a glove box, but it was a real motorcycle. It would go like a bat out of hell. And it completely changed my life. And all the other people in the Boy Scout troop did the same thing. And we were immediately a social problem. And I discarded with that any willingness to believe in the lost tribe of Israel and cross the ocean submarines. It was quite a number of extraordinary things you go find in but I went on with this great spiritual longing, which was, a hunger I hardly know how to describe, And I read an article, I think it was in the Harvard Theological Review, about something called the Good Friday experiment, which Tim Leary and a guy named Walter Pankey had conducted on Good Friday in, I think, 1960, something like that, where they had taken a bunch of grad students and put them in the chapel at Boston University for the day, and had given half of them psilocybin and the other half niacin. Can't remember what else they had in their placebo cocktail, but it definitely get you into an altered state, not necessarily what you'd like.
Right.
You'd know they'd given you something. And the interesting thing was that, without exception, the ones who took the psilocybin had a profound religious experience. They all felt that they came into the presence of the holy, and none of the ones that took the placebo did. So I wanted some of this God drug. If I could get some of it, and it was late, so Leary and company didn't want to accommodate me that particular night, but they turned me on to a friend of mine, a friend of theirs at Wesleyan, who was more than happy to do so. Very shortly thereafter, and we had an institution at Wesleyan at that point. One of the ways in which Wesleyan was spending all its money was that they had something called the Curry concert every Friday night, where there was a wonderful old farmhouse out in the woods in Connecticut, and they had an ethnomusicology program that was second to none, and they had in residence Ravi Shankar and Naraswamy, Nayasar, God, I can't pronounce his name, and Ali Akbar Khan, and two or three other, really significant classical Indian musicians. I went to that, and there was my friend, and he gave me a God-seeing dose of LSD, and I sat down and started listening to the music until I became it, and then transcended it. And then I went back to Millbrook quite a number of times and got to know Tim pretty well. I frankly was a little skeptical about things at Millbrook. Ram Dass had been in his earlier guise was just an unbelievable snake oil salesman, and so was Tim to a certain extent. And I was suspicious of him, but I was certainly less suspicious of them than I was of what I had heard was going on the West Coast, which I thought was just an appalling, catastrophic tale of drug abuse, where they were filling up, bathtubs full of Kool-Aid and mixing in LSD and giving people a paper cup, which just sounded like a recipe for some kind of mass hallucination and catastrophe.
Right, and it was happening like on a daily basis, right? I mean, it wasn't like, whoa. Go ahead.
Well, they were on a weekly basis anyway. I mean, the acid tests were happening once a week, all up and down the West Coast, and getting pretty big. And I was just appalled at this, and so was everybody else in the Eastern Orthodox Church of LSD.
Right.
And it's funny that as it turns out, when you look at long-term freakouts or, people whose minds were altered in an unfortunate way. Our method out there in Millbrook turns out to be much less successful in keeping that from happening than the jolly multitudes tripping together. As I think the Grateful Dead went on to prove, certainly there must have been days at Dead shows where half the audience, if not more, was on acid, and the audience was, 120,000 people.
Right.
You get 60 or 70,000 people on acid together, and you'll summon something up.
Well, I mean, I'm dedicating my show to stuff like that. Although in theory, well, not in theory. Well, in Millbrook, are you? I think it's just so important for you to articulate this stuff because were people taking the God strand of acid in isolation? Is that what the difference was at Millbrook?
Well, I mean, the idea was that your first trip and many thereafter really would be a very reverential and largely solitary event where and frankly, when I turn somebody on for the first time, I still am inclined to use this method, but they'd make sure they were together with somebody that they knew intimately and trusted absolutely, and in a space that was one that was extremely familiar and non-threatening to them. And there'd be a lot of preparation, reading various pieces of literature, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or the Upanishads, or whatever you care to read, to focus your mind. And then you would take, if it was your first time, you would take a real walk with the king dose, not one of these. Oh yes, I feel a nice fuzzy sensation.
Right. No, it got watered down in the late '90s.
Your personality would be completely disassembled like a dissected frog, and you'd have an opportunity to examine its pieces and reassemble them yourself, and wouldn't be able to talk for 4 or 5 hours. And play soothing or inspiring music in the background and that kind of thing. And that's I think that's actually, in a sense, you only take acid once. I mean it has its extraordinary effect on your nervous ecology, and it really is an ecological drug because it kicks into motion a whole sequence of concatenating events throughout your psychoneuronal hormones that once that's happened, they never quite reset into the same location. So it is kind of a permanent choice.
Right.
Not to say that you're fine one day and somebody gives you some acid and ever after you're addled somehow. Though I've certainly seen a few occasions where that seems to have been the case. I don't mean
to laugh. No, I know it's. I know it's.
There were other factors in the the psychedelic derelicts I've known over the years. But in any case, the idea was I think fairly sound in the sense that if you're only going to take acid once for real, you want to make it count. You want to leave as little chance as possible. There's an irony in that, which is that part of what you learn from LSD is that the universe is benign and need not be controlled to your satisfaction, and in fact is vastly rich classroom full of lesson material that is specifically designed for you. And if you're trying to control that experience, you are leading yourself away from serendipitous encounters that you might have otherwise with what you're really supposed to learn.
You know, as we put a button on this, I could talk for hours with John Perry Barlow about this, but I wanted to ask you, did you, when you got yourself, at Wesleyan, when you were sort of comfortable and were sort of selecting people that you wanted to dose and they wanted the experience, did you seek out people that were pretty square at all, or not introspective, and then after they tripped out, they came back and said, wow, I really got a lot more in touch with myself? I just feel like today, we live in I don't know, just as a 36-year-old, I just feel like there's obviously demagoguery around, drugs, acid. I've been told was legal.
Well, yeah. we're still fighting, as you alluded to in your intro. We're still fighting a hard-pitched battle between the 50s and the 60s.
But my parents were in the 60s.
One of the battle lines is LSD.
Why?
Why? Because LSD, among its various altering characteristics, is it just completely wipes out God-given authority. It makes unauthority seem hilarious, or unearned authority seem hilarious. And there is absolutely nothing that authority hates worse than to be found hilarious.
I love it.
You know?
It's so spot on. It is so, yeah, right. Continue. The battle is still.
So naturally, they would be putting people away for a mandatory minimum of 40 years if they were handing out something that made all
right.
the great white column of God's ordained authority seem ridiculous.
That's right.
And that's the thing.
Wow.
You do have this in Western culture. You had the utter dominance for a very long time of a great white column with God on top and you on the bottom, and a great many men in the middle who had the authority over you that had been given to them by God Almighty and could not be questioned on those grounds. And by 1968, 1970, that belief was gone in America, whether you took acid or not. That was gone overnight.
Wow.
I mean, and prior to that, even somebody like Neil Cassidy still believed that the man had God and therefore had something that he kind of had to pay attention to.
My God, just profound here. John, I get off on this show on individual style and individual sound, and you were only a hop, skip, and a jump away from New York City on Metro North at Wesleyan, and I just, I love asking people things they've never been asked about, and you look at Lee Morgan, Miles Davis, it could be Tony Williams, anybody, these cats, the jazzers especially, just were ferociously individualistic people. They wanted to have their own sound. It was predicated on individuality and being different, not being uniform. And I just wanted you to talk to the audience about being a poet, taking your art, going into the city and seeing. Did you go to a lot of jazz clubs in the Lower East Side? What was the kind of music you were getting off on in college?
Oh, I've always been completely eclectic in that regard. I get off on the top 10% of everything.
Right.
And or maybe 15, maybe 20.
25.
well, maybe 60, but I'm not that picky. I love music, and I have extremely comprehensive taste. I was raised on country and western to some extent because I was living in Wyoming, but we were also one of those dark places on the map where at night you could get the voice of Don's record parlor, Cunha Quatla, which had a 150,000 watt transmitter right across the border, broadcasting to you the nightly musical selections of Wolfman Jack. So Wolfman Jack had a lot to do with my sense of what music was, and he introduced me to what was still called race music in those days, and I became a huge R&B fan. There weren't very many white people that knew much about it, and then then it was rock and roll. I mean, I came into awareness really as the golden era of rock and roll, and that was very definitely the dominant factor in my sense of what music was.
How many times did you, before you settled out, maybe you settled out in California, but how much of the road, how much travel across the country did you do? And songs like Let It Grow or Cassidy, I mean, how much of your writing were you doing on LSD and within the natural environment of our country?
Well, I disappoint you, but I can't right offhand think of a single song I wrote on acid.
Okay, I did some. I went to Boston University. Yeah, go ahead.
It's my practice to take more than it was,
right.
I would be right on.
Okay, gotcha.
But on the other hand, it was all written on acid.
Unpack that. That's very interesting.
Well, it was all written by somebody who had rearranged his mental furniture, so that my perspective was one that was very different from the perspective of somebody who still was clinging to the old way. So that that's just imbued in it. It wouldn't be that easy to pick it apart and say, oh yeah, well that obviously is the acid-inspired phrase. It's not like that, but it partakes of a way of understanding and defining reality that is very definitely based on having taken that drug and taken it very seriously. I don't think of it as a drug at all. I think of it as a kind of a just-in-time donation from the Almighty to humanity, just as we're about to really crater ourselves for lack of awareness that everything is connected.
Well, and the
planet is small.
Right. The thing that I'm interested in, I guess, more is sort of the point. I guess there's just so much visual imagery and there's so much nature in your songs, and so I'm just trying to figure out. So forget the LSD. Obviously, when I was at Boston University, I did marginal work when I was eating sugar cubes that were more watered down with speed, less acid, late '90s. But that's when I saw you at Harvard. Actually, we talked about Brent there for a little while. But the thing is,
that's good.
Did you travel a lot with Neil
Cassidy? Did you take?
Oh God, I wish I had. But you know, Neil was shortly to leave the scene at the time that I arrived in it, and he was primarily in residence during the summer and fall of '67, which is when I was hanging around the dead house. But he was certainly very vividly and exquisitely in residence. He'd be at it 24 hours a day.
Wow.
There was a sort of a conservatory or a study on the second floor that was also known as the music room. And there was a large collection of kind of funky blues records and an old tube-type stereo. Maybe it wasn't even stereo. And in the middle of this room was the couch that was Bob Weir's home at the time. He had all of his worldly goods in a paper bag at one end of his couch.
Right.
His circumstances have changed, ironically. And Neil would be in there much of the night. He'd take off his shirt, he'd down a full 25-pill bottle of Benzedrina, and then just like a shot glass, and then he'd be juggling that little machine hammer of his with the headphones on and dancing around the room and singing scat to whatever jazz it was he was listening to. Really, and Weir would be lying there with his eyes wide open, apparently trying to sleep, or possibly he was asleep. It was a little difficult to tell in those days.
Right.
But his pupils were invariably larger than his irises, so you'd look in there and you just see the 1,000-parsec stare, and it looked at times like he was making Neil up.
Right.
He was the dream creator that had summoned forth this completely improbable character. But I didn't travel much with Neil. I went on a short road trip with him one time, along with him and a couple of girls, which was memorable mostly for going down a very steep hill in San Francisco on Divisadero Street in a Cadillac that had acquired this characteristic they often acquire after a certain age, which is, bubbles and leaks in the power steering hydraulics. Mm-hmm. So the front wheels would just they had a mind of their own, and you didn't steer this car, you herded it. You had a stochastic relationship with the actual direction of the vehicle. It was a little bit like those old-fashioned elevators. I doubt anybody in your audience remembers those old-fashioned elevators that had the handle where you had to allow for the inertia of the elevator and turn it to off at just the right moment in order to glide up to the floor right on. The steering was like that in that car, and Neil's got a couple of fingers on the wheel, and he's turned fully around, and I don't know why I didn't have one of these girls in front with him, because he always had a girl barnacle to him.
Right. They were both with you. They were with you.
Yeah. I was no competition for Neil Cassidy,
right.
Let me tell you.
Uh-huh.
Not then, not now.
Mm-hmm.
But he was carrying on completely different conversations with the three of us simultaneously, and missing the cars on Divisadero by nanometers, and not even watching. And I just knew that I was in the presence of the Avatar, and it could do whatever it wanted. And as long as I was within that cone of protection, nothing too bad was going to happen to me.
we have a game on this program called Name That Tune, John, and so I'm going to put on this tune right now for you, and then we'll come back and break it down, okay?
All righty. That's a good. Oh golly, I couldn't begin to remember the first time I went to Salt Lake City because that was our city. You know, I mean, we lived out just north of the middle of nowhere, and you know, my county in Wyoming is a little bigger than Connecticut, and it has 4,000 people living in it. So it's not what you'd call an urban environment. And my mother, well, my father too, to a certain extent, were both kind of sartorial dandies. They were in politics, and they loved to dress up, and so they were always getting Salt Lake for clothing in part. But also, my grandfather lived down there. He moved down there when his health started to deteriorate enough that he needed to be at a lower altitude. And so we always had a place in Salt Lake, our own. And I always kind of regarded Salt Lake as being, you know, another dimension. It was like another room in my home.
Mm-hmm.
And it was my experience with, you know, a collection of large numbers of people, or at least large by my standards in those days. Yeah, well, the Mormon girls really are great. There's a reason for that, by the way, which is that some Mormon elder, and I think it was actually several, and I believe one of my forebears was one of them, decided that a great place to recruit would be Denmark and Norway, and to some extent Sweden, but Denmark and Norway were both being savagely oppressed by the then very nasty Sweden, and people wanted out, and so they went up there and they proselytized like crazy, mostly with the Swedish, not the Swedish, but the Danish and Norwegian girls, and as a consequence, there is a huge amount of Mormon genetic code that is tall, blonde, aquiline featured.
What? Can you give me a year on this? What was it like? What year was this?
That would have been in the 1860s, 1870s, probably.
So you get this like icy blue, long legs, blonde hair, kind of. That's now you're painting.
Yep, that's the one.
Well, okay, so but just humor me and my generation that grew up, swinging to this. That was also a live. Ironically enough, that was the clip we played was from a live Bobby and the Midnight Show from '83 from Lugano, Switzerland. Billy Cobham took the guys back there. Billy lives there, or did live there. Maybe still has a house there. But for instance, like Salt Lake City, when it starts to swing like that, I mean, I know the lyrics of yours, but did you work with Weir on sort of every song that I get off Estimated, Salt Lake, it has a swing element where you kind of would you do how much of the besides the lyrics, paint the picture of Barlow and Weir working.
Well, Weir was a rhythm guitar player, you have to remember. And as such, he didn't necessarily even know what the melody was. Mm-hmm. And I had to have a melody. So you just can't write lyrics without being able to sing them in your head. So you have to have the melody in there. So what I had to do was to make up the melody to fit the chords, and figure out where the verse was and where the chorus was and all that stuff. So with very few exceptions, all of my Grateful Dead songs, I wrote the melody in addition to the music.
Unbelievable. Okay, so greatest story.
And that's often the case with supposed, lyricists. I mean, just because we don't do the chords and arrangement and all that kind of thing doesn't mean that we're not actually contributing musically, because you can't make a good song if you can't sing it.
Do you?
There's a commonly held belief among would-be songwriters that songs are just kind of like poetry, and that all you have to do is write a poem, and then somebody else can set it to music, and that's just not true. I mean, I guess it's true to the extent that people force themselves to do it, but it's really not the right way to go about it.
When Hunter handed Bobby off to you and said he's all yours,
yeah.
Did you guys? Was it just a match? Was it just a match made in heaven immediately? And what did Bobby it's
never been a match made in heaven. I mean, Bobby and I are one another's brothers, really. I mean, we didn't actually have brothers. He had a stepbrother who was extremely abstract and not related to him in any way, and he being adopted, and he had actually now he has brothers, interestingly enough, when he finally discovered his adopted father.
Wow.
Turned out
wow.
Interestingly enough, his father's eldest son, or what he thought was his eldest son, had just died right at the time that Bobby showed up to claim the title. And Jack Barber, Bobby's father, had been bombing the shit out of the Vietnamese all the time that Grateful Dead was coming. B-52 pilot.
Mm-hmm.
An absolutely wonderful human being, by the way. And he also, completely coincidentally, and probably irrelevantly, he also flew over my house in Wyoming at a very low altitude countless times, because there was a low-altitude training run from Minot, North Dakota, that brought a B-52 wing around through Wyoming and then back at about 250 feet off the ground. And my house was one of the turning points, the landmark. So I was quite close to Jack on numerous occasions before I finally met him. Anyway, to get back to the very discursive completely lost the plot.
You guys were brothers. You guys were brothers.
But we are brethren. It's just that we are, in many respects, for all our similarities, we are really different in a couple of very central things. One of which is that, my primary poetry instructor was a guy who regularly received awards for his translations of people like Sophocles and Euripides, where you had to take another language and get it to scan perfectly and land on the line. Had to find the one over and over again in a foreign language. So he was really good at this stuff, and he helped me be good at this stuff. And I became kind of obsessed with phrasing that would emphasize the way in which the word fit. Well, Bobby phrases things like a guy would walk if he had two pairs of knees. So, it's a very different thing that he would do to the time signature, which would change, several times in a song. And that would have the words ending up all manner of places, or the beat within the words. It was hugely frustrating. But the fact remains, I have to confess from this distance that it was that very dynamic tension between my wanting it to be right on the money and he is wanting it to be something more, what was his word for it? Angular.
That's right. It was always angular. Yeah.
Angular. Yeah. I think the thing was that Bobby felt so. He felt so belittled by the rest of the band. He felt so dismissed in his musical abilities and in every other regard, really. I mean, he was just a kid. And as a consequence, he felt like he needed to differentiate himself by having something that sounded really challenging and avant-garde. I always disagreed with him about that. And I think, history has kind of proved to be right when you look at the songs that survive. They're all those very neatly configured Hunter and Garcia songs where everything is just exactly where it belongs. But
except if you yeah, go ahead.
But a lot of people did like my songs with Bobby, for their own reasons, and it did make up a different element in the ecosystem. So it wasn't a monoculture.
I just wanted to ask you, as we wrap up here, part one. I mean, I wanted to talk to you about your startup in Brazil and Africa, and we'll have to get to that at a later point. But could you talk about, in your mind, the differences between you and the other, I can't believe I'm going to say this, the almost JV other writer of the dead, Robert Hunter. Could you talk about the differences between the two?
I'm
No, see, I heard that, and I don't agree with that, man. No, I don't agree with that because if someone's on the JV, it means they're not good enough to make. all I'm going to say is I haven't been able to get to Hunter yet, so I'm frustrated with him. You're not JV. You're on the real deal. But I just wanted you to talk about, what's up, the differences.
Well, I have enormous respect, admiration, and awe, and unfortunately a toxic load of envy for Bob Hunter. I mean, he, like Dylan, is one of those things that God talks to, and I would love to be one of those things that God talks to. I just didn't. I mean, God is perverse. That's one thing I know about it. And naturally, it would choose somebody like Bob Dylan or Bob Hunter to be its mouthpiece rather than a far more worthy me. But I think Hunter's songs people will be singing Hunter's songs 500 years from now, if we're lucky. If there's still people singing in 500 years. People will be singing Hunter's songs then.
But do you feel like, especially back when you were, collaborating with the Dead on those early albums, I mean, Robert clearly had mutual respect for you. I mean, you're pretty, you don't sell yourself short. You guys have always had a good, he respected what you were doing as well, man. I mean, my brain was boiling and my reason is spent, but, God, I mean, you're... Well,
some of the time he was, some of the time he didn't, some of the time he didn't. I mean, and it was hard to tell in any case because I was so, I felt so completely outgunned that any admiration that Hunter had for me was a little difficult to, get past the contempt that I had for myself by comparison. And I just didn't think I was in the same league as Hunter at all. He had so many lines that I would give, minor physical organs to.
like holes in the knees of my blues, man. Listen, all I got to tell you, Barlow, is that there's legions of cats that are loving your lyrics, man. So, I mean,
well, I know that, and I'm really delighted that that's true. I mean, one of the things I realized a few years ago is that the secret of life is learning how to accept love, and one of the ways in which love is tossed into your lap is through the praise of fans. And, I've always been very resistant to accepting that praise because I had love to pay for it. And now I recognize that it's none of my damn business whether I think that goes on. It's not my opinion that counts under the circumstances. It's the other parties. And so I'm very grateful to those deadheads who come up to me and say that. And instead of telling them they're wrong, which I realize now is complete horseshit, I tell them that I'm very glad that they like that song and that whatever cockamamie notion they have of what it really means is absolutely true.
Well, let me tell you something, okay? I never saw the Dead one time, and I feel a bit of a galactic spirit. I lack a lot of theory and understanding of rudimentary stuff, but I'm connected to Brent, and so not even see. I'm not some cockamamie deadhead. What I am is somebody who understands. Just to me, it's like Barlow. It is connected because I feel very connected spiritually to the galaxy and to the spirit. So I'm overwhelmed. I I thank you for taking the time, and wherever you are, Mobile Bay or out in where, we got more to do. And I happy Valentine's Day, man. I really love talking to you, man.
Well, it was a great pleasure. We should do this again sometime.
I look forward to it, my friend. Enjoy your afternoon, and I'll talk to you soon.
Oh, yeah.
Adios.